This was an $800,000 a year stockbroker interview. However, the man walked into the office in tattered clothes, with paint still smeared on his face. The supervisor who recommended him was instantly stunned. The company boss, Frome, looked on with clear disgust. But instead of offering any excuses for his appearance, the man came clean, saying he'd been held overnight by the police for failing to pay parking fines, which left him no time to change into proper clothes. That only made Frome more annoyed. Glancing at Chris's resume, which listed nothing more than a high school diploma, he quickly grew impatient and threw out a tough, tricky question just to end things.
What would you say if a guy walked in for an interview without a shirt on? And I hired him. What would you say?
Chris paused for a moment, then gave an answer on the spot.
Must have had on some really nice pants.
It was the perfect mix of wit and charm. The four interviewers chuckled, and even Frome's attitude began to soften. In the end, Chris landed the internship in stock brokerage thanks to his way with words. But he couldn't bring himself to feel happy, because only now did he learn that the 6-month internship would be completely unpaid, and he'd be competing with 19 top-tier graduates for a single full-time position. For Chris, who was completely broke, this wasn't just a challenge, it was a gamble on his entire future. If he failed, he and his son would be out on the streets. The risk was overwhelming, but he decided to take the leap for the life he had always dreamed of. He could never forget that day when he passed the stock exchange and saw a red sports car parked on the street. At the time, he curiously asked the Ferrari owner 2 questions.
This is for you. What do you do and how do you do it?
I'm a stockbroker.
Had to go to college to be a stockbroker, huh?
You don't have to. Had to be good with numbers and good with people. That's it.
Hey, you take care.
As he watched the Ferrari owner drive away, Chris couldn't take his eyes off the confident, joyful faces around him. Faces full of success and happiness that stirred something deep inside him. From that moment on, he dreamed of becoming a stockbroker. He only had a high school diploma, but he'd always excelled at math. Maybe, just maybe, he could try his luck at a brokerage firm. But when he shared his dream with his wife, Linda, all he got was sarcasm and ridicule.
Stockbroker.
Yeah.
Not an astronaut?
Sure, the idea was unrealistic, but it still hurt to hear her say it that way. Linda didn't hold back. She lashed out at Chris, calling him useless and blaming him for everything wrong in their lives. And Chris had no defense, because 2 years ago, he had invested their entire savings into a batch of bone density scanners, even paying extra to become the exclusive distributor in San Francisco. He thought the machines would lift them out of poverty. But reality hit hard. No clinic wanted these expensive devices that offered only slightly better imaging than standard X-ray machines, at double the price. And the sudden economic crisis in the 1980s, America made the scanners he was selling even harder to get rid of. Day after day, Chris kept hustling, making no money, while racking up parking tickets from rushing between pitches. Eventually, his only means of transportation was towed away by the police, and he could only sigh on the sidewalk, knowing he couldn't afford the fine. To ease the burden, he enrolled his son in the cheapest daycare he could find. It had no real curriculum, and the environment was terrible. Even the wall murals had spelling errors, defaced with offensive graffiti. Meanwhile, Linda worked 2 jobs just to keep the household afloat. But no matter how frugal they were, they still owed 3 months' rent. The weight of survival pushed Chris to keep going, but once the seed of hope is planted, it eventually takes root. One day, while out trying to sell a scanner, Chris noticed a brokerage firm called Dean Witter Reynolds was hiring interns. So he walked up to a hippie girl singing on the sidewalk, handed her $1, and asked her to watch his scanner for a moment, telling her it wasn't worth much anyway. Then he headed into the office to grab an application form. But before he even finished listening to the details, he looked out and saw the girl running off, with his scanner in hand. He sprinted after her, but no matter how hard he chased, she remained just out of reach. At the subway station, he stood helplessly as his family's entire monthly expenses disappeared down the tracks. This world is full of illusions, but pain never lies. Chris swallowed his frustration and kept moving forward. The night passed, and morning light spilled across the sidewalk. The next day, Chris filled out the application form and personally handed it to the HR manager, Jay. He hoped to introduce himself, but Jay didn't even look at him. Thankfully, life isn't all cold shoulders. Sometimes it brings you unexpected second chances. The same hippie girl who stole his scanner reappeared before him. Chris chased her down the street, shouting loudly to claim what was his. He didn't care about the traffic or the strange looks from bystanders. Right as the bus was about to pull away, he managed to grab back what belonged to him. But was this really a lucky break? When Chris returned home empty-handed yet again, this time with another useless scanner in tow, Linda had already reached her limit. She began to resent him, and the warmth between them vanished in the face of hardship. The love they once shared, the promises they made, had all been shattered under the weight of hardship. Chris tried to win back his wife's heart, gently reassuring her, everything's going to be okay. But it was clear, Linda wasn't buying it. That night, Chris sat alone in the living room, fiddling with a Rubik's Cube. In 1981, it was the hottest toy in America, but few could solve it. Even math professors at the University of San Francisco took at least 30 minutes. For Chris, it was a breeze. And it was this very toy that sparked a turning point in his life. For the next month, he waited outside the Dean Witter Reynolds building every single day, hoping to catch Jay. Eventually he did, but Jay was in a rush, heading to a meeting in No Valley. Thinking quickly, Chris lied and said he was also heading to No Valley. And just like that, he ended up sharing a taxi with Jay. Inside the cab, Chris launched into an enthusiastic self-introduction, but Jay was completely absorbed in the Rubik's Cube. Annoyed, Jay handed it over to Chris, who calmly began explaining how the puzzle worked. The driver noticed and deliberately slowed down. He was just as fascinated by the Rubik's Cube. To Jay's amazement, Chris solved the first side with ease. By the time they were halfway there, 2 more sides had fallen into place. And when they finally reached their destination, Chris was just 1 step away from finishing the cube. Right there in the taxi, with both men watching closely, Chris solved it in just 23 minutes. Jay was stunned and silently made a note of Chris's name. So caught up in the moment, Jay even forgot to pay the fare. Watching the meter climb higher and seeing only $5 left in his thin wallet, a bold idea began to form in Chris's mind. As they neared a traffic light, Chris took a chance. The moment the driver looked away, he jumped out and made a run for it. But halfway down the street, he realized he'd left the scanner on the passenger seat. He wrestled past the angry driver, yelling apologies while sprinting away with everything he had. In the sunlit park, people strolled in peace. But Chris, in his suit, was sprinting like his life depended on it, with a furious yellow cab chasing him down. In desperation, he ducked into a subway station. Hope was just ahead. Behind him, the driver's furious shouts echoed closer and closer. He didn't dare slow down. 1 second too late, and he'd be caught. With a final burst of energy, Chris dove onto the train just as the doors were closing. But the scanner was too big. It got left behind, trapped outside the train. Sometimes the greatest distance in the world isn't measured in miles. It's standing inches away from something, knowing you can't reach it. Just like that, the family's monthly living expenses were gone. His mood was like the sudden downpour outside, cold, heavy, and without a trace of sunlight. Chris called his wife, begging her to pick up their son for him, but Linda had already lost all patience. Because Chris failed to pick up their son on time, Linda, who had to work a night shift, was delayed by an hour, and that became the final straw that broke the camel's back. When Chris rushed home, he found the apartment completely emptied. Not a single piece of clothing was left in the closet. It was clear Linda wasn't coming back this time. Just then the phone rang. It was the HR manager from Dean Witter Reynolds, informing Chris he had an interview scheduled for the day after tomorrow. For Chris, this wasn't a lucky break. It was the result of a month's worth of relentless effort. The next morning, he ran into Linda outside the kindergarten. He no longer begged her to stay. He only asked her not to take their son.
Just go get happy. But Christopher's living with me. Did you hear what I said? Christopher's living with me.
That afternoon, to make sure of it, Chris picked up his son early. But as soon as they returned to their apartment, the landlord came knocking, furious. He ordered Chris to move out by noon the next day, fed up with 3 months of unpaid rent. Chris pleaded, and the landlord reluctantly agreed to give him 1 more week, on one condition. Chris had to repaint the apartment walls, but when it rains, it pours. The very next day, 2 police officers knocked on the door. Because Chris had been ignoring his parking tickets, the court now demanded immediate payment in full. Chris wrote a check, but the bank couldn't verify it until the next morning. Until then, he would remain in custody. Out of options, Chris had no choice but to call Linda, the woman who had already walked away, and beg her to watch their son for one night. Though Linda was completely disappointed in Chris as the mother of their child, she had no reason to say no. They may not have been the perfect couple, but neither had abandoned the role of being a parent. The next day, Chris finally resolved the ticket issue, but now, only 30 minutes remained until his big interview. There was no time to change. He sprinted straight to the office, still covered in paint. When Jay saw him covered in paint, he was completely stunned. But Chris was completely honest. He laid out every awkward thing he'd gone through, and when it came to his limited education, he answered with total honesty.
I'm the type of person, if you ask me a question and I don't know the answer, I'm gonna tell you that I don't know. But I bet you what, I know how to find the answer, and I will find the answer.
Right after that, Frome threw out a tough question, but Chris handled it with a touch of humor that lightened the room. In the end, thanks to his seriousness and quick thinking, Chris successfully secured the stockbroker internship. But the 6-month unpaid program, and the fact that he had to compete with 19 elite graduates for a single position, still left him filled with uncertainty. Unless he could sell the remaining 6 bone scanners during this period, there was no way he could financially survive until the internship ended. That evening, Linda returned with their son as promised, and also delivered her final goodbye. Her sister in New York had arranged a decent job for her. Love is passionate and impulsive like a storm, but marriage is built on quiet companionship and mutual support. And when one partner no longer feels happiness, they have the right to walk away. Looking at his sleeping son, Chris no longer hesitated. He made a choice to fight once more for his future and for his child's. Unable to afford their current rent, Chris and his son moved into a cheaper roadside motel. On Saturday, he took his son to play basketball, just like he'd promised. Among all the sports, Christopher loved basketball the most. His dream was to become a professional player, but Chris jokingly said, "Like father, like son. I was terrible at basketball, so you probably won't be much good at it either." Hearing this, Christopher immediately lost all enthusiasm. He walked off quietly, hiding the disappointment in his heart. Chris realized his careless words had hurt his son. He quickly tried to make it right.
People can't do something themselves, they want to tell you you can't do it. You want something, go get it. Period.
Sometimes words can cut deep, but the right words and encouragement can also heal. That day, Christopher learned a valuable lesson in self-worth, and Chris found a renewed sense of hope for his dream. The next day, while out selling scanners, Chris met an orthopedic doctor who was direct and decisive. He bought a scanner without hesitation due to its precision. That $250 sale was enough to get Chris and his son through the next month. As a new week began, Chris officially started his internship. The manager, Alan, handed all 20 interns a phone list of employees from Fortune 500 companies in the financial district. Their task was simple: do everything they could to pitch the firm's financial services and turn those wealthy contacts into loyal clients. The intern who brought in the most business over 6 months would have the best shot at landing the full-time role. There was also another metric, an end-of-term written exam. Though it didn't weigh heavily in the final evaluation, it still couldn't be ignored. During lunch break, Chris was planning to step out for a sandwich until he saw a homeless man carrying one of his scanners. Without thinking, he took off running to catch him. The man noticed and sped up too, forcing Chris to sprint across a busy street.
Hey, asshole!
While Chris himself wasn't injured, one of his shoes disappeared in the process. The driver offered to take him to the hospital, but Chris declined. He couldn't risk being late and leaving a bad impression. So, wearing just one shoe, Chris limped back to the office on time. But Alan seemed to have a certain bias against him. All day long, he sent Chris on coffee runs, making him feel undervalued and overlooked. Unlike his carefree colleagues with no financial burdens, Chris had to juggle rent payments, childcare, and strict pickup times for Christopher. That meant he had to complete 9 hours worth of work in just 6. But after 2 months of hustling, he still hadn't signed a single client. Chris began to suspect his strategy was wrong, so he reordered the contact list by seniority and started from the top. He first reached out to the president of a retirement fund. Coincidentally, the man had a meeting canceled and agreed to speak with Chris in person, if he could arrive in 20 minutes. But at that very moment, Alan ordered Chris to park his car. Chris didn't want to, but he couldn't say no. Due to a faulty door lock, it took him quite a while to get the car door open. By the time he looked back, the last nearby parking spot had already been taken. He had to drive off in search of another spot, only to get stuck in morning rush hour traffic. Out of time, he settled for a temporary parking spot and dashed toward Ribbon's office, but the receptionist told him the president had just left. What should have been a golden opportunity slipped right through his fingers. To make things worse, Alan's vintage car now had a parking ticket. That evening at a restaurant, he submitted the parking ticket reimbursement for Alan, then told his son they'd go to the hospital over the weekend to try selling the scanner. But Christopher had his heart set on watching the football game. Before heading to the hospital that weekend, Chris took his son to Ribbon's house. He rang the doorbell, just to apologize for missing their last meeting. His sincerity surprised Ribbon. Chris also casually mentioned he'd be attending the football game later. From their last call, Chris knew Ribbon was a football fan, and with a major game happening that day, there was a good chance Ribbon would attend, and maybe invite him along. And that's exactly what happened.
Hey, you guys want to come with us?
What, to Candlestick?
We're going now. Come with us. Where are your seats?
Oh, we are upper deck.
We got a box. Come on. You want to sit in the box?
Chris ended up riding to the stadium with Ribbon. It gave him more time to connect with this influential man. Standing beside Ribbon, surrounded by high society, Chris felt like he belonged to a different world. As the thrilling match came to a close, Chris began talking about his firm's impressive asset management capabilities. Ribbon appreciated Chris's character, but said he wasn't ready to invest just yet. Still, Chris didn't walk away empty-handed. Thanks to Ribbon's connections, he received a stack of business cards from other wealthy individuals, and they could all be future clients. In the next 2 months, Chris was incredibly lucky. He managed to sell the remaining 4 scanners. The income was just enough to support him and his son until the internship ended. But life's blessings often come with unexpected blows. Because he'd fallen behind on several months of taxes, the government suddenly withdrew $600 from his bank account. No warning, no notice. In an instant, Chris was left penniless. And to make matters worse, the motel manager came knocking for rent. Chris could only fall back on his usual tactic, delaying. But sometimes, fate throws a lifeline. While playing with his son in the park, Chris spotted the homeless man who had taken his scanner. He immediately ran over to confront him. The unhinged man insisted the scanner was a time machine and claimed he was preparing to cast a spell to transport himself back to the 1960s. Chris didn't bother arguing. He just grabbed the machine back with his own hands. On the bus, he cleaned it carefully, determined to make it usable again. He then took his son to the hospital for another sales pitch. But during the demo, the scanner malfunctioned and failed to start. The doctor told him to come back once it was fixed. He would still pay full price. That night, darkness fell, but Chris no longer had a place to sleep. The motel manager had zero tolerance for late rent. He threw all of Chris's belongings out like trash and piled them by the door. The locks were changed, the windows shut tight. Chris had no choice but to take his son and leave. They wandered through the subway, with nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Helplessness became the leading role in this darkest hour. To help Christopher fall asleep, Chris borrowed the ramblings of the homeless man from the park and told his son the scanner was a time machine. All he had to do was close his eyes and press the button, and they'd be transported back to the Jurassic era.
Oh my goodness. What? Open. You don't see all these dinosaurs?
To avoid the imaginary T-Rex, Chris told him they had to hide in a cave, a public restroom. He locked the door, spread toilet paper across the floor, and held his son close in his arms as he drifted off to sleep. Outside, someone kept pounding on the door. Chris braced it with his foot, determined to protect their last shred of peace. It was the most hopeless moment of his life. But as a father, he had no choice but to hold up the sky by himself. Though the night had forced tears from his eyes, the next morning, Chris appeared as if nothing had happened. That kind of quiet resilience, wounded behind closed doors, strong in public, is all too common in the adult world. To have a place to sleep that night, Chris took his son to the church shelter and lined up early. When it was finally his turn, there was just one bed left, but a homeless man behind him took advantage of a moment's distraction and cut in line. The two got into a heated argument, but the staff didn't ask questions. They simply threatened to kick them both out. Chris nearly broke down. Thankfully, an elderly man standing nearby stepped in to speak up for him, and they were allowed to stay. Once his son was asleep, Chris stayed up, trying to fix the scanner. As dawn broke, he began studying for the upcoming theory exam. From that day on, Chris had to push himself even harder. He had to finish work by 5 p.m. so he could rush to the church shelter and claim a bed. This exhausting routine nearly broke him, but Chris never gave up, because his number of clients was steadily growing, all thanks to the connections he made through Ribbon. With the final theory exam approaching, Chris even studied during lunch. All his calmness and confidence were the result of quiet, relentless effort. On exam day, Chris was the second to turn in his paper. Even Alan, who had doubted him from the start, looked surprised. But Chris had no choice. Any delay would cost him the church bed. He rushed out of the office and ran into Frome, who had forgotten his wallet. Chris had only $8 to his name, but still pulled out $5 and handed it over for Frome's taxi ride. He solved a crisis for his boss, but at the cost of almost everything he had left. Worse still, that night the church was already full. Chris and his son were once again left with nowhere to go. The golden sunlight of the evening fell across Chris's disappointed face, but brought no warmth or hope. At a nearby table, a family laughed joyfully. Their happiness made Christopher gaze longingly. It was a feeling he and his father hadn't had in a long time. A 2-cent subway ticket became their bed for the night. With nowhere else to turn, Chris sold his own blood. With that money, he bought a tiny light bulb. The broken part needed to fix the scanner. After putting his son to bed, Chris sat in the hallway, quietly fixing the machine. Whether he and his son would escape homelessness came down to this one piece working again. The light flickered on, cutting through the darkness and into Chris's heart. The kind-hearted doctor bought the scanner as promised. The $250 gave them 4 weeks of breathing room. That night, Chris and his son stayed in a motel. Exhausted in both body and spirit, they fell asleep together on the sofa. The next day, after work, they went to the beach, leaving behind the noise of the city to enjoy a moment of peace. Thanks to the wealthy contacts he met at the football game, Chris ended the internship on a high note. From one company alone, Pacific Bell, he signed 31 clients. Jay had been watching all along. Regardless of the outcome, Chris had already earned his respect. Today was the final day of the internship. Alan called Chris into his office. It was the most important day. Chris walked in, nervous and full of anticipation. All those quiet, grinding days had led to this, finally giving meaning to all his perseverance.
Because tomorrow's going to be your first day. If you'd like to work here as a broker. Would you like that, Chris?
Yes, sir.
Was it as easy as it looked?
No, sir. No, sir, it wasn't. Thank you.
Oh, Chris. I almost forgot.
He walked out, overwhelmed with emotion, tears streaming down his face as he clapped for himself in the middle of the bustling street. At last, the storm had passed, and sunlight was waiting at the end of the road. This is a true story. Chris Gardner went on to become a millionaire. He even made a brief cameo at the end of the movie. Though the film is titled The Pursuit of Happyness, real life isn't about happiness knocking on your door. It's something you fight to earn. And that pursuit is rarely smooth or easy. You may face failed investments, heartbreak, prejudice, blunt rejections. You may fall into rock bottom, drained by the weight of reality. There may be no morning sun to warm your soul, no cozy harbor waiting for your return, and no generous stranger to pay your way. It's a path full of hardship, a lonely journey. It demands self-discipline, emotional resilience, a spirit clad in confidence, and a heart armed with determination. You carry belief like a torch, lighting your way through the dark. Life won't let hard work go to waste. Time will not forget the people who fight with everything they've got. So believe this: The key to the door of happiness is forged from every day you give your all. And perhaps what truly matters in this film isn't just the pursuit of dreams and hope, it's Chris's attitude. Even in the worst of times, he remains optimistic, sincere, confident, and composed. As one quote says, "The highest form of living is optimism on the face, sincerity in the blood, diligence in your actions, calmness in your presence, and wisdom in your soul." May we all be like Chris, able to rise above pain, still looking toward the light. There may be endless problems in the future, but never let your head hang low. Because our journey continues, our dreams are still alive, and hope is always with us.